Okay, hello everybody. My name's Rachel. Thank you for inviting me here. When I was asked to come and speak, I thought, oh gosh, me? What can I contribute? What can I say? Because I used to be an astrophysicist. I used to do science back over a decade ago. And then I had my children, and I was then involved in schools outreach and talking to schools about science and faith. But gradually, that's had to take a back seat as my children have been born. I had one. My youngest was born at 25 weeks and has had a number of issues. My middle child is autistic and is partly homeschooled. So I found that more and more my life revolves around this tiny little bubble in the village that I live in and the church that I'm in. And I don't get a chance. I mean, literally coming on the train here was the first time I've been on the train on my own for 8 years. It's quite a big thing, me being up here. But what I can talk about is the grassroots, what it's like as a scientist in an ordinary church who doesn't have the academic life or all of those things. But what can we do just as scientists who are embedded in our ordinary church? How can we make a difference there? And I've got 3 points to cover. The first one is to be known as a scientist. The second is to be a source of wisdom. And the third one is to reach out. So starting off with being known. There's one body, but it has many parts. And part of who I am in the church is a scientist, but that's not the most obvious bit. It's much easier when you go to church to be on the flower rota, or you're one of the readers, or you help with the Sunday school, or whatever it is you happen to do. Do people in church know that you're a scientist? And if not, how do we make sure that they do? Because purely by existing in our local church, we make a difference. We don't have to have answers. We dispel myths purely by existing. I think in the young generation that I work with quite a lot, there's less awareness of the conflict between science and faith than maybe there used to be in the past, which is very encouraging, but it's still there. And we've got a 14-year-old in our church family who no longer comes to church. He's recently stepped back from school, church and everything, and has said to his parents recently, I don't believe in God anymore. I believe in science. And his parents, they're a social worker and a linguist. They weren't sure, but what they could say was, but what about Rachel? And what about Keith? And what about the other scientists in our church? They didn't know the answers, but they knew that we existed. And that immediately gets rid of one of the barriers to faith. If you can just say, look, I'm a scientist and I'm a Christian, so it really can't be that much of a problem. And if you can build up that trust, as you were saying, if you can build up that trust, then we can do 3 things. We can help people not to fall away when they come across questions. We can help them to grow in their faith and to grow to understand more of God. And we can inspire our young people to actually want to know more of God. And practically, we do this just by existing. There was a lad in our church, a man who was known as Stephen the Scientist. He had a surname, but I don't know what it was. He was in the church for about 3 years, but we didn't know what his surname was because he was Stephen the Scientist. That was his identity, almost how he introduced himself, how we introduced him. He was great at just being a scientist. Now, he worked in some sort of chemical stuff at Grangemouth, I'm not quite sure what, but he was passionate about science and he was passionate about God, and that really came over. So what can we do practically? How do we engage with our churches? Really small things, like Gavin had a t-shirt earlier. If you think people don't know you're a scientist, I'm not one for t-shirts, but some people love the t-shirts with the slogans. If I spot someone with a NASA t-shirt on or something like that be my background, I go up and have a chat to them about science. Oh yeah, I used to do that. That was really cool. Talk about things. Put an article in a church magazine. I went to a conference about science and Christianity. It was really interesting. If anyone's interested, come and talk to me. Probably no one will come and talk to you, but they'll have read it and they'll know. And if they did have a question, maybe they'd approach you in the future. Talking to children in particular. Did a kids talk a while back on infinity? Great one for an astrophysicist, talking about God being infinite. Great fun. Or talking about to a youth group and giving your testimony. There are lots of ways that you can share with your congregation that you are a scientist and a Christian. And that really just helps to build that relationship, to break down barriers. The second point, so my first point was just to be known as a Christian, a scientist, sorry. The second point is to be a source of wisdom. Peter says, as each has received a gift, use it to serve one another. And I just always think, well, I'm an extragalactic astrophysicist. There aren't really that many questions. If it's about black holes, I'm good. But, you know, even the sun and stars, I don't know much about those. That's my scientific brain thinking. That's the way I think when I'm a scientist. So, oh, that's not my area. That's not my area. But actually, to my church family, I am a scientist. Which means that I can analyze data and read papers and see beyond the headlines. And they will come to me with all sorts of science questions that I know nothing about. But what I can do is I can walk with them. I can be prepared to try and answer these questions and to walk alongside them, to use some pastoral skills to pray desperately for some help, and to walk alongside them in these questions, which they don't know where to look for answers, and they've come to their church scientist. So if we're known in our church, I'll give you a couple of examples. People talk to me about neurodiversity. They talk to me about sex and gender. A new Christian recently, 19-year-old lad, came up and wanted to talk about evolution. And COVID vaccine. People want to know, should I be vaccinated? Should I get my kids vaccinated? What's the evidence? I read this in the paper. My mum sent me this article. What's the evidence? And they trust scientists to give them some insight in that. They trust Christian scientists. So it's really important that we're embedded in our local churches and actually able to have these conversations. And my third point is reaching out. The psalmist says, your works are wonderful. I know that full well. I know that. There's a passion for God's creation out there, but how do we pass that on? How do we pass that on to those outside the church and to the next generation? One example is to do science experiments, to put science into our church life whenever we can. So one thing I help run is a light party. It's an alternative to Halloween. We do it for the kids in the village. We do a light party at the end of October. And we now have a little stall where we have light science experiments. And some of them point to biblical things like we have about the light in the darkness. And it's run by a few teenagers from the church. And these are teenagers who are into science. One of them is one of my sons, and they're very into their science. And it gives these young scientists a chance to serve in their church using science and inspire them. And it gives them a chance to show the rest of the world that there's not a conflict here. In fact, this is God's amazing creation. God made light, and look at all these cool things light can do. It's great to be able to get science into the church. Another example is prayer stations. If you have a church that has prayer stations around, you can have ones based on scientific experiments and finding out things about God's world. There are so many ways to explore science within our church. We just need to think a little bit about it. And my final example I was going to give is when I'm giving a talk in public, a talk in schools, not that I do much of this anymore, I'm talking in public, I always try to mention that I'm a Christian, and that's quite a difficult thing to do when you're going and giving a pure science talk. But what I do is I have a slide on stereotypes. And I say, you don't have to be a man to be a scientist. I'm not. You don't have to have a beard. I definitely don't have a beard. You don't have to like Star Trek. It's fine if you do like Star Trek, but I'm not a big fan of Star Trek. You don't have to be an atheist. I'm not an atheist. I'm a Christian, and I know people who are Christian and Buddhist and Hindu and Muslim and atheist and agnostic. And I just drop it in there as a kind of dispelling myths slide. And the number of times someone will come up to me afterwards and say, I'm a Christian too. That was really inspiring. I was really excited to hear that. Just to throw little things out there, just to show that we exist. And I hadn't talked about God at all in the talk, but that little link there had really helped to build somebody up. So just to go over my 3 points again, be known as a scientist. Find a way to make sure that your church family know that you are a scientist, or that you're interested in science, that you have a passion for it. Be a source of wisdom, not just in your specialist area, but in every area that people come to you. Try to help them in that, in all the ways that you can, with humility, obviously, because it's not your area, and reach out. And let's show the world that we know a God who made this world, and it's awesome. Thank you.